Yeah, my name is Tavares Strachan, and we're sitting in my studio in Midtown, New York. I think I'm generally afraid of being afraid. I think that's the driver for my interest in exploration. Usually the thing that you see me doing, I'm profoundly afraid of. I think it's why before we started this interview, you asked me how the show was going, and I said I was a little bit scared about some elements of it, because these are things that are new, and I think there's a beautiful poetic relationship between fear and knowledge. And I think one's proximity to fear has a lot to do with their proximity to knowledge. I think there's something very magical about smallness or being raised in a small place. I think one of the things that starts to happen is you start to understand these micro networks of people, the community that relies on each other, how things get produced, how food gets serviced throughout the community, who's responsible for the cleanup, who's going to paint the houses, who's going to be the plumber. I think these networks are quite interesting, and I think you have immediate access to those networks from a very young age. I think there's an inherent sense of wonder in the limitation. I mean, I think the neighborhood I grew up in, I don't remember leaving the block for a good 4 years, after I was born. So that was my perspective of the world. There was a neighborhood called Baintown in Nassau, Bahamas. And so much of my worldview was being shaped in that small city block. I think it allowed for a certain level of imagination. And once I was able to find my way to the edges of the island, through work a little bit older and working with fishermen, I was able to start thinking about exploration and the stars and thinking about the possibilities for storytelling. There is so much work about how human beings are different, and I'm interested in how we're the same. And one of the ways in which we're profoundly the same is the fact that the way that we operate, our universal currency is storytelling. We tell each other stories to heal each other, to soothe each other, to get full, to be empty, to exercise, to understand one's mental and physical health, and to understand our place in the universe. So I think storytelling is essential to the human experience. And no matter where you're from, stories are going to ground you in some way. I think stories are the glue that holds this kind of human civilization together. I think without stories, I think we'd find it harder to relate to each other. So making the Encyclopedia of Invisibility is really first and foremost about an idea, right? So it starts off with the story of Matthew Henson, which is the first polar explorer who made it to the North Pole. And I think that idea was the seed that became the kind of tree, which is the encyclopedia. It was me alone at first, and then I worked with a small team. And eventually all this research was demanded and edited, and it took 15 years to produce. So it took quite some time. But I wanted to find a place to put all the things that were misplaced. It turns out that invisibility is not about the absence of information, but it's more about a refusal to look. I think the question of untold stories is a very interesting and potent question. Because for me, the thing is, who's making the statement that the stories are untold? So many of the stories are really told, but just at a scale that is almost imperceivable. And what I'm interested in about this idea of these imperceivable stories is that on one level, these are highly important, significant stories. For example, the story of Matthew Henson, who discovered the North Pole, is known by a few, and as time is passing on, we're starting to learn that more and more people are picking up on the story of Matthew Henson. But the reason why that story is significant is because what he did was incredibly significant. You know, being able to traverse the North Pole in 1909 as a black man, I think, is a very critical piece to that story that makes it more than just a story. It's a story of triumph. It's a story of overcoming. It's a story of perseverance and curiosity and exploration, which we don't necessarily associate, curiosity and exploration with a black man living in 1909 in America. So I think that is an incredible story. So I was many years ago, I was asked by the LA County Museum and SpaceX at the time if I was interested in collaborating with them. And at the time I was doing this research on Robert Henry Lawrence, and I was spending some time with his nephew. And I was really fascinated about the idea of time, like what is time? And the great Einstein, his imaginations on time has to do with the fact that time's not linear. And so if that was true, then for me the question was, well, could someone who's passed away have the opportunity to go into space? And what does that even mean? And the collaboration kind of matured, and we created this golden urn and kind of imbued the spirit of Robert Henry Lawrence in this urn, and then we launched this into space, into high orbit. And in a way, at least the story of Robert Henry Lawrence was now a part of this making it into space story. And it was one way, again, of thinking about a story in relation to the kind of the grandness of the character. I think memory is quite complex for me, mostly because the negotiations of how we understand the world are always in flux. I think what we know, how we find out what we know, is always changing. And so, in a way, memory could be a strength or it could be a weakness, right? If you look at it from the lens of processing information and trying to make kind of calculations and assertions about the way society is going to move. So much of dogma comes from memory, right? So much of how we understand the complexities of otherness and fear is about memory. I remember this bad thing happened to me by this particular subject at this particular time, therefore it might happen again. And the likelihood could be that that thing never happens to you ever again, and that has to do with memory. So I think it's interesting to think about memory from the standpoint of conceptual decision making. What role is memory playing in your worldview, and how much of those memories are useful today? I think when you grow up in a place where everyone looks the way that you look, and then you look in institutional books and you look at photographs of things that are perceived to be important, like the picture of the Last Supper in your grandmother's wall, one with the small amount of curiosity might want to ask the question, well, why are these people in our house, and why do they look so radically different from the way that we look, and why do they have this perceived idea of being elevated in some way beyond the way that we were understanding ourselves? I think if one allows oneself to ask the question, one starts to realize that the power is actually in the question. All of our magic is in our ability to be curious about the world around us. Converting the Last Supper into the First Supper was a way for me to think about so much of the institutional knowledge that we have in the Western world and their African roots. For example, Christianity as a concept has so many roots in Africa, and specifically, one good example of this is the word Messiah, which the word Messiah is pulled from, is a reference to the Messiah warrior. So to think through the institutions that predate kind of Western institutions of knowledge is interesting to me. I think it's fascinating because I think the story of Africa really connects all human beings, because obviously the first human evolved from Africa, mitochondria Eve. And I think, again, those bits of information, when you give access to those bits of information to the masses, it ultimately changes you, which I think in some degree is the purpose of art making. I think me playing the role of Judas in the First Supper has a bit of melancholy to it, in the sense that there is something sacred, very sacred, about telling these stories. And I think there is a little bit of tension between, the storyteller and the subject. And there's some diplomacy that one would have to exercise in negotiating how one tells a story. And it could be from interacting with some of the characters' family members, thinking about how they would want to be represented. I think all of these micro elements are critically important. And so, in a way, the Judas character is someone who I have a lot of empathy for, mostly because if you follow the Judeo-Christian story, Judas, in a way, was birthed from the beginning of time to betray the Messiah, right? So think about that, like he was destined, that was his destiny, in a way in which he had very little control to a certain extent over. And I find that layer to that story quite interesting. In the same way that the Messiah came to save the world, Judas was sent to betray the Messiah. And so I think that dichotomy and the melancholy of that and the empathy for that character, who in my instance is I'm telling the story, and in various aspects of my community, revealing certain elements of this story is a kind of betrayal to a certain extent, in a way. Yeah, I think there's a very interesting relationship that I've been unpacking between art making and, being a director or a composer or even a conductor. I think for me, mining the glue that holds all of the pieces together, whether it be my interest in science or my interest in apparel or my interest in bronze making or ceramic work or painting, I think the thing that binds all of them together is the story. And I think being able to compose the stories using all these various elements in ways in which can kind of lead the viewer to the question is what I'm motivated by. I think so much of art has to do with, the bourgeois kind of establishment. And for me, I don't come from that history. So as a maker, my role is to try to empower the common viewer when they walk into an exhibition space or out into a public town square where they're going to be looking at sculpture. The point for me is to make that viewer feel powerful in a way that I maybe didn't feel powerful growing up. And so my kind of role as a composer, my air, if you will, is more to do with trying to find ways to recenter power and gift that power back to the audience. So in 2005, I moved 4 tons of ice from the Arctic to my elementary school. And looking back at that work that happened in 2005 and looking forward to the work that I'm doing today, I think the thing that they all share is this kind of curiosity about stories, because that whole block of ice was about the Matthew Henson story, you know, the infamous North Pole explorer. And I think it's about language, because I think one of the fascinating things about language is if you meet a guy at the side of the street and you're trying to find a direction, he can draw a map of it. That's one way to get you to where you have to go. He can write a list, turn right, turn left, or he can verbally describe that thing to you. So whether it's a block of ice or it's a piece of bronze or it's a painting, for me, I think the story of me trying to get from one place to the next is what brings it all together. I think the reason why I'm saying that is I think there's this idea that people may have that an artist's role is to recreate things that constantly make the audience feel safe and comfortable. The way you do it is by repeating and mastery of materiality, right? That's what the definition of an artist is. For me, I'm not sure that that's what it is. I think it is imbuing the world with a sense of questions about all things. Everything must be on the table, including one's commitment to a particular craft and a way of thinking or making. I think these should all be on the table. My interest in blackness is really about this fascination that I have with the galaxies in the night sky. Because when I was a kid is all I had to look at when I was on the ocean. And there's a certain idea of infinity that exists within this kind of galaxy black that's deeply fascinating. And again, it's a connective tissue. It's egalitarian. It's the kind of thing that whether you're in Norway or whether you're in Kingston, Jamaica, you have access to the same night sky. And that's my fascination with the blackness of the night sky. I think if you just imagine for 1 second, growing up on an island that is 21 by 7 miles, it's the size of the full island, and then going on the boat for the first time, and then seeing the horizon where there was no land. So you on a boat and there was 360 sky and ocean. And that relationship completely opened up my imagination. I would say that we are living in quite interesting times. I think, for me, I think what's important is trying to find the inner child through one's process. I think my process in particular is a kind of search for my own inner child. And the works that I'm making, I think, is for that child. And I think if you speak to like a clinical psychologist about this idea, I think they would say that in a way we're all trying to find that inner child in the work that we're all doing. And a huge part of the success of that work is to do with this idea that there's some idea of truth or purity that is embedded in that child. So if we're trying to serve that inner child, then we kind of stay on target.